It was a clear and sunny morning on June 27th, with the fresh warmth of a midsummer day, when the people of the village began to congregate in the square for the lottery. The children assembled first. Boys and girls selected stones, stuffing their pockets with the smoothest and roundest ones. Before long, there was a great pile of stones occupying one corner of the square, and the very small children rolled in the dust or clung to the hands of their older brothers or sisters. Soon the men began to gather away from the pile of stones in the corner. Their jokes were discreet, and they smiled rather than laughed. Wearing faded house dresses and sweaters, the women showed up shortly after their menfolk. They greeted one another and exchanged bits of gossip as they went to join their husbands. Soon the women, standing by their husbands, began to beckon their children, and the children came reluctantly, having to be called 4 or 5 times. The lottery was about to begin, presided over by Mr. Summers. He was a round-faced, amiable man, and he ran the coal business. People felt sorry for him because he had no children, and his wife nagged him ceaselessly. When he arrived in the square, bearing the black wooden box, there was a murmur of conversation among the villagers, and he waved and called, "Little late today, folks." The postmaster, Mr. Graves, tagged along behind him, carrying a 3-legged stool. The stool was positioned in the center of the square, and Mr. Summers set the black box down on it. The villagers kept their distance, while Mr. Summers stirred up the papers inside it. There was a story that the present box had been put together from some pieces of the box that had preceded it, the one that had been constructed when the first people settled down to make a village here. Every year after the lottery, Mr. Summers raised the issue of a new box, but every year the subject was allowed to fade away without anything being done. The black box grew shabbier each year. By now it was no longer completely black, but splintered badly along one side to show the original wood color. There was a great deal of fussing done before Mr. Summers proclaimed the lottery open. When Mr. Summers had confirmed that everyone was present, he cleared his throat and inspected the list. "All ready?" he called. "Now I'll read the names. Heads of families first, and the men come up and take a paper out of the box. Keep the paper folded in your hand without looking at it until everyone has taken their turn. Everything clear?" The people had done it so many times that they only half listened to the directions. Most of them were quiet, wetting their lips, not looking around. Then Mr. Summers raised one hand high and announced the names one after another. The villagers grinned at one another humorlessly and nervously. They had to step forward to draw a paper. Then all through the crowd there were men clutching the small folded papers in their large hands, turning them over and over nervously. Some villagers even whispered that the inhabitants of a village in the north were talking of abandoning the lottery. However, this opinion was dismissed as foolish and nonsense. Mr. Summers called his own name and then stepped forward precisely and extracted another slip from the box. After that, there was a long pause, a breathless pause, until Mr. Summers, holding his slip of paper in the air, said, "All right, fellows." For a minute, no one moved, and then all the slips of paper were opened simultaneously. Suddenly, all the women began to speak at once, saying, "Who is it? Who's got it?" Then the voices began to say, "It's Hutchinson. It's Bill. Bill Hutchinson's got it." People looked around to see the Hutchinsons. Bill Hutchinson was standing quiet, staring down at the paper in his hand. Suddenly, Tessie Hutchinson shouted to Mr. Summers, "You didn't give him enough time to take any paper he wanted. I saw you. It wasn't fair." Disregarding Tessie's protest, Mr. Graves emptied the papers out of the box onto the ground and then put 5 papers in for the Hutchinsons. As Mr. Summers called their names, each member of the family came up and drew a paper. When they opened their slips, they found that Tessie had pulled out the paper with the black dot on it. Mr. Summers instructed everyone to hurry up, and there was a fuss in the crowd. "All right, folks," Mr. Summers said. "Let's get this over with quickly." The pile of stones the boys had made earlier was ready. There were stones on the ground with the scraps of paper that had come out of the box blowing around. One villager selected a stone so large that she had to pick it up with both hands. The children had stones already, and someone handed little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. Tessie Hutchinson was in the center of a cleared space by now, and she held her hands out frantically as the villagers moved in on her. "It isn't fair," she said. A stone hit her on the side of the head. "It isn't fair, it isn't right," Mrs. Hutchinson screamed, and then they were upon her.